The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the USS Enterprise. As Commander Wade McCluskey checked his dive bomber for the third time, something felt different about this mission, and electric tension that made even the most seasoned pilots pause mid-conversation. 6 months after Pearl Harbor had thrust America into the Pacific War, the Japanese seemed unstoppable, their naval forces sweeping across the ocean like an unstoppable tide. Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood in the command center at Pearl Harbor, studying intelligence reports that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. The Americans had achieved what many considered a miracle. They had broken the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25. Through painstaking work by cryptographers led by Commander Joseph John Rockford, they knew something extraordinary: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's entire battle plan for what the Japanese called Operation Me. The intelligence was almost too good to believe. Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, intended to lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle near Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Japanese admiral commanded the most powerful naval force ever assembled, for fleet carriers to light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers. Over 160 vessels carrying Japan's finest pilots and most experienced crews. Against this armada, Nimitz could muster only 3 aircraft carriers: the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which should have required months of repairs after the Battle of the Coral Sea, but was made battle-ready in just 72 hours through round-the-clock work at Pearl Harbor's shipyard. The American force included 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 16 submarines, a David facing Goliath in the vastness of the Pacific. Captain Miles Browning, Admiral William Frederick Halsey's chief of staff, pored over reconnaissance photographs of Japanese fleet movements. The enemy's confidence seemed absolute. According to intercepted communications, they expected to find Midway defended by perhaps a dozen aircraft and a handful of Marines. They had no idea that Nimitz was positioning his carriers northeast of the atoll, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance, but perfectly positioned to strike. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron gathered his torpedo squadron around him. On the deck of the Hornet, these men knew they were flying outdated aircraft against superior opposition, but their determination remained unshaken. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were slow, poorly armed, and vulnerable, yet they represented America's primary striking capability against Japanese carriers. The Japanese plan seemed flawless on paper. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would launch a devastating airstrike against Midway's installations, while Admiral Yamamoto's main battle fleet waited in reserve. Once the American fleet arrived to defend the atoll, as they surely would, the Japanese would destroy them with overwhelming firepower. The victory would open the door to Hawaii and potentially force American capitulation in the Pacific. This account draws from extensive documentation preserved in the National Archives and records administration, as detailed in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Official Naval History of World War II. But unknown to the Japanese, American codebreakers had given Nimitz the ultimate advantage: complete knowledge of enemy intentions. As sunset painted the Pacific in brilliant oranges and reds on June 3, 1942, both fleets steamed toward their destiny near a remote atoll that would determine the fate of nations. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, the Japanese carrier force launched its first wave toward Midway. 108 aircraft, K torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters rose from the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga. The pilots were confident, their aircraft representing the finest naval aviation technology in the world. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, watching the perfectly executed launch. His pilots had destroyed the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor. Today they would finish what they had started. The morning air was crisp, visibility unlimited, perfect conditions for naval aviation. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at 5:20 in the morning, when the enemy aircraft were still 93 miles out. Major Floyd Bradley Parks, commanding Midway's air defenses, scrambled every available fighter, a mix of obsolete Brewster F-A Buffalo and newer Grumman F Wildcat aircraft. 26 fighters rose to meet over 100 Japanese attackers. The battle above Midway was savage and brief. The American fighters, many flown by inexperienced pilots in inferior aircraft, fought with desperate courage against the veteran Japanese crews. Captain Marion Eugene Carl led a section of Wildcats in a head-on attack against the Cape bombers. his guns chattering as he pressed his attack to point-blank range. But the Zeros, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans could field, quickly established air superiority. On the ground, Marines manning anti-aircraft guns watched the aerial battle with growing dread as American fighters fell like autumn leaves. Sergeant Harold Michael Thompson, commanding a 3-inch gun battery, kept his crews firing even as Japanese bombs began falling around their positions. The sound was indescribable, the whistle of falling bombs, mixing with the staccato bark of machine guns and the deeper boom of anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Tomonaga's bombers found their targets despite the fierce ground fire. The powerhouse, fuel storage tanks, and several buildings erupted in flames as Japanese bombs found their marks. But the runways remained operational, and many of Midway's aircraft had been safely dispersed or had taken off before the attack began. The damage, while significant, was not the devastating blow the Japanese had planned. More critically for Japanese plans, Lieutenant Tomonaga radioed a message that would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack. Wave. The first strike had damaged Midway, but not destroyed it as a military base. This assessment would force Admiral Nagumo into a crucial decision that would alter the course of the battle. At the same time, American search planes were reporting contact with Japanese forces. Lieutenant William Adams Chase, piloting a PBY Catalina flying boat, spotted the enemy carrier force and radioed the historic message, carrier bearing 320, distance 180. The Japanese fleet had been found. Captain Richard Edward Fleming led 6 Army Air Force's B-26 Marauder medium bombers in a desperate low-level attack against the Japanese carriers, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire. Fleming's aircraft pressed their attack with suicidal courage. Though they scored no hits, their attack convinced Admiral Nagumo that land-based aircraft posed a significant threat to his carriers. The morning's action had drawn first blood, but the decisive moment was yet to come. On Midway, smoke rose from burning buildings, but the American garrison remained defiant. In the Japanese fleet, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision about his second attack wave. Unknown to him, 3 American aircraft carriers were racing toward launching position, their flight decks spotted with aircraft whose crews would soon write their names in history. As the sun climbed higher over the Pacific, both sides prepared for the battles that would determine whether Japan's rising sun would continue its expansion or begin its long descent toward defeat. Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance stood calmly on the bridge of the Enterprise, watching his air groups prepare for launch. Unlike the aggressive Bull Halsey, who lay sick in a hospital bed, Spruance was methodical, calculating exactly the kind of commander needed for this decisive moment. At 7:02 in the morning, he made the decision that would change naval warfare forever: launch all available aircraft immediately, even though it meant his planes would be operating at maximum range. The American carriers erupted in controlled chaos as 116 aircraft prepared for takeoff. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, their crews checking ordnance one final time. Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo planes, newer and more capable than the aging Devastators. Wildcats fighters, fewer than desired, but all that could be spared. Every pilot knew this was the moment they had trained for their chance to strike back at the enemy. That had surprised them at Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Elbert Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. These men understood their mission's terrible mathematics. Torpedo bombers had to approach enemy carriers at low altitude and slow speed, making them perfect targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Yet they prepared for takeoff with grim determination. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the most crucial decision of his career. His first strike against Midway had returned with Lieutenant Tomonaga's recommendation for a second attack, but his ship's hangars held aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes intended for use against American warships. To attack Midway again, these weapons would need to be replaced with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. The decision to rearm consumed precious time. Japanese ordnance crews worked frantically to change weapons loadouts, while maintaining their ship's combat air patrol. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines cluttered the carrier decks, a dangerous situation made worse by combat operations. At 9:18, a Japanese reconnaissance plane reported sighting American surface ships, but the pilot failed to identify them as carriers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, on a course calculated to intercept the Japanese fleet. But when they reached the expected position, They found empty ocean. The Japanese carriers had changed course after recovering their Midway. Strike force. McCluskey faced a pilot's nightmare, low on fuel over a vast ocean with no target in sight. The first American attack came from Midway itself. Major Lofton Russell Henderson led 16 Marine Corps' SBD dive bombers in a high-altitude attack against the Japanese carriers, flying through murderous anti-aircraft fire. Henderson's Marines pressed their attack with desperate courage, though they scored no hits. Their appearance confirmed to Admiral Nagumo that American forces remained active and dangerous. These details of the carrier battle formations and tactical decisions are documented extensively in the action reports maintained by the Naval Historical Center, Washington, D.C. At 9:25, the moment of truth arrived for the American torpedo squadrons. Lieutenant Commander Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Japanese fleet from the southwest, flying their obsolete devastators barely 50 feet above the waves. Japanese Zero fighters fell on them like hawks among sparrows. One by one, the American torpedo bombers were shot down in flames. Ensign George Holden Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, watched his squadron mates die around him before his own aircraft was shot down. Floating in the Pacific amid burning wreckage, Gay would become the only American witness to what happened next. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons seemed complete. Not a single torpedo had found its target, but the heroic attacks by the torpedo bombers had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high altitudes undefended. Unknown to the Japanese, Wade McCluskey had turned his dive bombers northward, following a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet. At 10:22, McCluskey spotted the enemy carriers spread below him like toys on a pond. The trap was about to spring in a way that neither side had anticipated. At exactly 10:24 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolled his SBD Dauntless into a near-vertical dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. 37 American dive bombers had found their targets at the precise moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, their decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft, their fighters drawn down to sea level by the torpedo attacks. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, leading his dive bomber section from the Enterprise, selected the carrier Akagi as his target. Admiral Nagumo's flagship was in the process of launching aircraft when Best's section screamed down through the morning sky. The Japanese lookouts spotted the American aircraft at the last possible moment, their warning cries lost in the roar of launching fighters. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie led 17 Dauntless bombers from the Yorktown in their attack on the carrier Soryu. The coordination was accidental, but perfect. 3 Japanese carriers under simultaneous attack, with no effective fighter cover and their decks loaded with volatile aviation fuel and ammunition. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi just behind her island structure, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among fully fueled Cape bombers. The explosion was catastrophic, setting off a chain reaction among stored ordnance and fuel. Within minutes, Nagumo's flagship was transformed from a fighting ship into a floating inferno. Like the Akagi, the carrier became a victim of her own stored weapons as fire spread rapidly among her aircraft. Japanese damage control parties, among the best trained in the world, found themselves fighting an impossible battle against aviation gasoline fires and exploding ammunition. The Soryu suffered perhaps the most devastating attack. Leslie's dive bombers achieved multiple direct hits, and within 20 minutes the carrier was dead in the water. Her flight deck buckled and her hangar spaces consumed by uncontrollable fires. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to abandon his ship, choosing to go down with the Soryu in the finest tradition of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On the bridge of the burning Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood stunned as his flagship died around him. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor watched 6 months of Japanese victory dissolve in 6 minutes of American precision bombing. Captain Taijiro Aoki finally convinced the admiral to transfer his flag to a cruiser, but the psychological blow was as devastating as the physical destruction. Lieutenant Clarence Earl Dickinson, piloting the Dauntless from the Enterprise, later described the scene below. The carriers were burning like torches as far as we could see. The smoke was rolling up thousands of feet, black and ugly. The sight represented the revenge that every American had dreamed of since December 7th, 1941. But the Japanese were far from finished. The carrier Hiryu, operating separately from the main force, had escaped the American attack. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding carrier division from the Hiryu, immediately ordered a counterattack. Within an hour, the devastating American strike 18 Cape bombers and 6 fighters were racing toward the American fleet. Ensign Gay, still floating in the water near the burning Japanese carriers, watched the drama unfold with a mixture of elation and dread. He had witnessed the destruction of 3 Japanese carriers, but he could see that one enemy carrier remained operational. The battle was far from over. At 11:30, Japanese radio operators aboard the surviving ships transmitted a message that would shock the Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu on fire, enlisting heavily. For the first time since the war began, the Kido Butai, the fast carrier striking force that had seemed invincible, had suffered a catastrophic defeat. The 6 minutes from 10:24 to 10:30 on June 4, 1942, had reversed the balance of naval power in the Pacific, but with one Japanese carrier still operational, and American ships still within range of enemy aircraft, the Battle of Midway was approaching its final, desperate phase. The question remained whether the Americans could finish what they had started before Japanese reinforcements arrived or the Hiryu extracted revenge for her sister ships. The USS Yorktown steamed serenely through this afternoon's swells, her crew celebrating the morning's devastating attack on the Japanese carriers. But their victory celebration was premature. At 11:50, radar operators detected incoming aircraft. Admiral Yamaguchi's revenge strike from the carrier Hiryu was racing toward the American fleet at over 200 miles per hour. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered his ship to general quarters as 18 Japanese Cape bombers, escorted by 6 fighters, approached from the southwest. The Yorktown's combat air patrol, reinforced by fighters from other carriers, rose to meet the threat. Lieutenant Commander John Smith Thatch, leading a section of Wildcats, employed his innovative thatch weave tactic to counter the superior maneuverability of the Japanese Zeros. The air battle above the Yorktown was fierce and brief. American fighters shot down several Japanese bombers, but enough survived to press home their attack. At 12:10, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same pilot who had led the morning strike against Midway, led his bombers in a perfectly executed approach despite having no landing gear due to battle damage sustained over the atoll. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck near the island structure, killing or wounding most of the personnel in the signal bridge. The second bomb exploded in the funnel uptakes, reducing the carrier's speed to 6 knots and filling her with choking smoke. The third struck the side of the flight deck, starting fires that threatened the ship's aviation fuel storage. Commander Clarence Elliott Aldrich, the Yorktown's damage control officer, led repair parties through smoke-filled compartments to restore power and control the fires. Working in extreme heat with emergency lighting, his teams performed miracles of engineering. Within an hour, they had restored the ship's speed to 20 knots and cleared the flight deck for operations, a remarkable feat that demonstrated the superiority of American damage control techniques. But Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. At 2:30 in the afternoon, he launched his second strike, 10 Cape bombers armed with torpedoes, escorted by 6 Zeros. This time the Japanese approached at low altitude, their torpedo planes skimming the wave tops in a coordinated attack that would test every aspect of the Yorktown's defenses. Lieutenant Arthur James Brassfield, commanding a section of anti-aircraft guns, watched the Japanese torpedoes streak through the water toward his ship. The Yorktown's captain ordered hard left rudder, and the massive carrier heeled over in a desperate attempt to avoid the underwater weapons. But the Japanese pilots had learned from their morning losses their attack was expertly coordinated. The torpedoes struck the Yorktown's port side within seconds of each other. The explosions were devastating, flooding the forward engine room and knocking out all electrical power. The ship took on a severe list to port, and Captain Buckmaster feared she might capsize. At 3 o'clock, he gave the most difficult order of his career: abandon ship. The detailed account of Yorktown's damage control efforts and eventual abandonment is preserved in the ship's action report, filed with the Office of Naval Records and History. The crew's evacuation was conducted with typical American efficiency. Destroyers moved alongside to take off personnel, while the carrier settled deeper into the Pacific swells. But even as the Yorktown fought for her life, American dive bombers were preparing to exact final vengeance on the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, despite his morning heroics, volunteered to lead another strike against the Hiryu. His aircraft was low on fuel, his crew exhausted from the morning's battle. But the opportunity to eliminate the last Japanese carrier was too important to pass up. At 3:30, 24 Dauntless dive bombers launched from the Enterprise and began their approach toward the enemy fleet. The Hiryu, operating alone after the destruction of her 3 sister ships, maintained a combat air patrol of 0 fighters, but Admiral Yamaguchi's pilots were exhausted from 2 strikes against the American fleet, and Japanese radar technology lagged behind American capabilities. The approaching dive bombers achieved complete tactical surprise. At 5:05 in the afternoon, McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attack on the Hiryu. Lieutenant Commander Richard Fleming, who had survived the morning's attack on the other carriers, planted his bomb squarely on the carrier's forward elevator. Other bombs followed, and within minutes, the last operational Japanese carrier was burning as fiercely as her 3 sister ships. Admiral Yamaguchi, like Captain Yanagimoto of the Soryu, chose to go down with his ship. As flames consumed the Hiryu's flight deck, he stood on the bridge with Captain Tomio Kaku, both men determined to share their vessel's fate. The age of the Japanese carrier striking forced the WWII that had seemed invincible was ending in fire and smoke beneath the Pacific sun. The Yorktown continued to float despite her abandonment, a testament to American shipbuilding and damage control, but her survival would prove temporary, and her final fate would provide one last dramatic chapter to the Battle of Midway. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4th, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto faced the collapse of his carefully orchestrated plan. From his flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles behind the carrier battle, he received reports that seemed impossible. All 4 of his fleet carriers were burning or sunk, their irreplaceable pilots dead or scattered across the vast ocean. The architect of Pearl Harbor stood on his bridge, contemplating the ruin of Japanese naval aviation. The WWII, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, no longer existed as a fighting force. Captain Kuroshima Kometo, Yamamoto's senior staff officer, suggested the unthinkable, withdrawal from the Midway operation. But Yamamoto was not ready to accept defeat. He still commanded the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific 11 battleships, including the massive Yamato with her 18.1-inch guns. Perhaps he could salvage victory through a night surface action, using his overwhelming firepower advantage to destroy the American fleet in a traditional naval battle. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now commanding the American fleet after Admiral Frank Fletcher's transfer from the damaged Yorktown, faced his own critical decision. His pilots had achieved an incredible victory, but his ships remained within range of Yamamoto's battleships and cruisers. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese main body was approaching from the west, seeking the very night battle that had served Japan so well in previous engagements. Lieutenant Commander Joseph John Rockford, the cryptographer whose code-breaking had made the American victory possible, worked frantically in his basement office at Pearl Harbor to provide Admiral Nimitz with updated intelligence on Japanese movements. His team monitored enemy radio traffic, searching for clues about Yamamoto's intentions. Aboard the destroyer USS Hammond, Lieutenant Commander Arnold Ellsworth True supervised the dangerous task of taking the abandoned Yorktown under tow. Despite the carrier's severe damage, salvage operations continued through the night. If the ship could be saved, she would represent not only a valuable military asset, but a symbol of American resilience. At midnight, Yamamoto made his decision. He ordered his surface forces to turn west, away from the American fleet. The Japanese admiral recognized that daylight would bring renewed air attacks from Spruance's carriers, and his ships lacked adequate air cover after the destruction of the WWII. The withdrawal marked the first time in the war that Japanese forces had retreated in the face of American opposition. Spruance, meanwhile, chose caution over aggression. Despite pressure from some subordinates to pursue the retreating Japanese fleet, he turned his carriers eastward during the night, maintaining distance from Yamamoto's battleships while positioning his force for renewed air attacks at dawn. It was a decision that would draw criticism from aggressive naval aviators, but reflected sound tactical judgment. As the sun rose on June 5th, American search planes found portions of the Japanese fleet still within striking range. The heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami, damaged in a collision during the night withdrawal, limped westward at reduced speed. Captain Richard Edward Fleming, leading 8 Marine Corps dive bombers from Midway, attacked the cruisers in a final strike that would cost him his life, but demonstrate American determination to extract maximum punishment from the retreating enemy. Fleming's attack on the Japanese cruisers, for which he posthumously received the Medal of Honor, is detailed in Marine Corps' historical records maintained at Quantico, Virginia. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, provided a final dramatic chapter to the battle. The submarine had been stalking the abandoned Yorktown and her escort vessel since dawn. At 1:36 in the afternoon, Tanabe fired for torpedoes at close range. The torpedoes struck the Yorktown, sealing her fate. The third torpedo struck the destroyer Hammond, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom within minutes. The explosion killed many sailors who had been working to save the carrier, including several who had volunteered to remain aboard the damaged ship. Captain Buckmaster watched from a nearby destroyer as his command finally succumbed to the Pacific waves. The Yorktown rolled over and sank at dawn on June 7th, 3 days after the battle. That had changed the course of the Pacific War. Her loss was tragic, but her sacrifice had helped secure the victory that marked Japan's first decisive defeat. The Battle of Midway was over, and for days of fighting, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, over 300 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. American losses, while significant, were far lighter: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. More importantly, Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific War and would never regain it. The morning sun illuminated empty waters where the mighty Kido Butai had once ruled supreme. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, reading battle reports that confirmed what intelligence intercepts had already suggested. American forces had achieved the most decisive naval victory in their nation's history. The numbers told only part of the story. Japan had lost not just for aircraft carriers, but the irreplaceable core of her naval aviation establishment. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived Midway wounded aboard the Akagi, later wrote that Japan lost the cream of her naval aviation. The pilots who died in the flames of the sinking carriers represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. Emperor Hirohito, receiving reports of the defeat in his palace in Tokyo, reportedly asked how such a catastrophe could have befallen the Imperial Navy. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, struggled to explain how the fleet that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier could be so thoroughly destroyed by a smaller American force. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockford, the cryptographer whose intelligence breakthrough had made the victory possible, received the Distinguished Service Medal for his role in the battle. His basement team of codebreakers had provided Admiral Nimitz with information that proved more valuable than additional ships or aircraft. The victory at Midway demonstrated how intelligence could serve as a force multiplier in modern warfare. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced the victory to the American people on June 8th. Though military censors limited the details that could be revealed, the president understood that Midway represented more than a tactical success. It marked the moment when American forces had proven they could defeat Japan's finest units in direct combat. For the Japanese, Midway's lessons were harsh and immediate. Admiral Yamamoto, though he retained Emperor Hirohito's confidence, never again proposed offensive operations on the scale of the Midway operation. The Imperial Navy's strategy shifted from expansion to defense, a fundamental change that reflected the new balance of power in the Pacific. President Roosevelt's address to the nation regarding the Midway victory is preserved in the Roosevelt Presidential Library Archives, Hyde Park, New York. The human cost of the victory was measured not just in casualties, but in the extraordinary courage displayed by American aircrew. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron and his torpedo squadron had attacked overwhelming odds. Knowing their obsolete aircraft offered little chance of survival, their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters away from the dive bombers that delivered the decisive blow. Captain Miles Browning, analyzing the battle for Admiral Nimitz, concluded that American success had resulted from superior intelligence, tactical flexibility, and individual initiative by commanders like Wade McCluskey. The Japanese, despite their technical expertise and fighting spirit, had been outmaneuvered by opponents they had underestimated. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's shipbuilding industry, already stretched thin by the demands of maintaining forces across the vast Pacific, now faced the challenge of replacing 4 fleet carriers while continuing construction of other vital warships. American industrial capacity, just beginning to reach full wartime production, would soon flood the Pacific with new vessels. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, recovering from his illness in a Pearl Harbor hospital, reportedly said upon hearing news of the victory, "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." His sentiment reflected the transformation in American morale at Midway had produced the enemy was no longer invincible. The Battle of Midway proved that intelligence, properly applied, could overcome numerical disadvantage. It demonstrated that American industrial democracy, though slow to mobilize, possessed resources and resilience that authoritarian regimes could not match in extended conflict. Most importantly, it showed that Pearl Harbor had not broken American fighting spirit, but had instead forged it into an instrument of retribution. As the wounded survivors of both fleets limped back to their home ports, a new phase of the Pacific War began. The defensive battles that had characterized the first 6 months of American involvement were ending. Soon, names like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima would enter American vocabulary as the tide of war turned inexorably toward Japan itself. The victory at Midway had given America more than a tactical success. It had provided the confidence and momentum necessary to carry the war across 6,000 miles of ocean to the enemy's home islands. The turning point Admiral Nimitz had sought had been achieved in the blue waters around a tiny atoll whose name would forever symbolize American naval aviation's finest. Our